Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that my running mate, Angela Walker, and I ran on in 2020. So there's a lot of news to discuss today. I think it was Lenin that once said, sometimes, well, nothing happens for years, and then sometimes years happen in weeks. And that's what the last few weeks have felt like. So we got to start with the genocidal wars in Palestine and Ukraine. And Palestine, just in the last 2 weeks, has bombed 8 UNRWA-run schools. That's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which aids Palestinians with health, education, food, and so forth, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And the U.S. has cut off funding. They were the major funders of that. And now Israel bombed 8 of those schools that were sheltering displaced Palestinians in the last 2 weeks, 8 schools. On July 13th, Israel made multiple airstrikes in an Israeli designated safe zone that killed at least 90 people and injured more than 300 others, many of these victims being children. And Israel said it was aiming at 2 top Hamas commanders, but Israel could not confirm they killed their targets, and Hamas says they failed. But going after 2 people, they killed almost 100 and injured another 300. This is just completely unacceptable. And these are war crimes. On July 10th, The Lancet, this respected British medical journal, published a study that calculates that the real death toll in Gaza, including those missing under the rubble and indirect deaths from malnutrition, disease, and other conditions brought on by the conflict, is now at around 180,000 people. That's 8% of Gaza's population. This is genocide. And so on Thursday, the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, ruled that Israel's occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza is illegal under international law, which is no surprise. It was pretty obvious. It said that Israel should end the occupation of the Palestinian territories immediately. It should tear down the apartheid wall. Israeli settlers in occupied territories should withdraw to Israel. That Israel should return land and immovable property to the Palestinians and should pay reparations to the Palestinians whose property and land was stolen. Now, the U.S. should join the World Court and accept its jurisdiction instead of rejecting rulings like this one that it doesn't like, while kind of accepting resolutions they do like the rulings against Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And U.S. hypocrisy here is ruining its standard in the post-colonial global South, and it's hurting Ukraine's efforts to build international support for its own anti-colonial struggle. And the foreign policy leaders in the Biden administration know this. I'm not sure Biden does. Maybe he did, but these days I'm not sure what he knows. But State Department and military personnel are resigning over this hypocrisy. But the Biden administration's Israel right or wrong policy continues. It's been the U.S. policy now for decades. And the stupidity, not to mention the immorality of this position, is just shocking. I mean, it's hard to really believe it's happening. And now Netanyahu is scheduled to speak before Congress next Wednesday. And before he got COVID, which was reconfirmed today, he still got COVID, Biden was going to meet with Netanyahu. And that may be off now with the COVID, but don't be surprised if Netanyahu meets with Trump. And, you know, it would be a good time for Biden to just say, okay, we're done with Netanyahu. He's repeatedly sabotaged the ceasefire and prisoner exchange agreement that the Biden administration has been saying for months is close. Netanyahu keeps punking Biden. But don't hold your breath for Biden to stand up to Netanyahu's games. and cut off offensive military aid to Israel. Unfortunately, it's probably not going to happen. So we have to keep the pressure on the administration, and particularly on Congress and the House. Only 37 members of the House voted against that $26 billion supplemental military aid package for Israel on April 20th. And we have to make cutting off military aid to Israel an unavoidable issue. And we can do that in the congressional campaigns in our districts, even if we don't have Greens running. Although if we did, it would be better. But, look at that. That's less than 10% of the House. So we got a lot of work to do to change U.S. policy toward Israel and Palestine. And then in Ukraine, it's now been a week since Russia made multiple strikes on Ukraine's Central Children's Hospital, as well as a maternity hospital in Kyiv. And Russia's bombarded over 1,400 hospitals and clinics as of last December, and of course more now. And yesterday, Russia had a missile hit a playground next to a residential apartment block in Mykolaiv, killed 10-year-old and 4 others. And these are just a fraction of over 120,000 war crimes that Ukrainian prosecutors are documenting. And Ukraine's resistance to Russia's genocidal invasion has really been tremendous. Russia called itself the world's second biggest army, but it's really shown it to be the second most effective army in Ukraine. But on the other hand, the Ukrainians are tired. I mean, I've been talking with Ukrainians all along, and that 6 months delay in U.S. funding was profoundly demoralizing. And now with Trump's new running mate, J.D. Vance, having said he doesn't care about Ukraine, and Trump himself saying he will cut off aid to Ukraine if they don't accept a deal with Putin on his terms that will cede Ukrainian land and people to Russia. Ukrainians are, really afraid of being abandoned by the U.S. to the recolonization and repression Russia has planned for them. Now, Europe is scrambling to Trump-proof NATO and the EU and keep aid going to Ukraine for its self-defense. But although Europe has collectively provided a little more aid to Ukraine than the United States has, Europe can't fill the gap, particularly in terms of military aid, if the U.S. cuts off its support. And that would be a tragedy. We get this Kremlin narrative that a lot of people on social media here and even mainstream media reports say that Russia is going to win. It's inevitable. But the fact is, Russia is cannibalizing its army with its meat wave attacks on the front lines. It's been losing an average of 1,200 soldiers a day now for 2 months. And, that's like 60,000 people. And it's losing armored vehicles so fast that they will largely be depleted by the end of this year, according to many military analysts. And meanwhile, Ukraine has crippled the Russia's Black Sea Fleet and its oil processing refining industry. So, Russia, if that's called winning, I don't want to win. And meanwhile, Ukraine's peace plan is moving forward. It got the support of the UN General Assembly a week ago, which resolved for the 3rd time, calling on Russia to completely withdraw from Ukraine. It also said, immediately from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant under International Atomic Energy Agency supervision. So I'm just saying, don't fall for the Kremlin line that Russian victory is inevitable. During the anti-Vietnam War struggle, we often would say Vietnam will win because cynics would say, they were hopelessly outgunned by the American invasion, but they won. And I think today we need to also say Ukraine will win and support giving them what they need to win. So that brings us to the Republican National Convention this week and their position on Ukraine. But I suffered through more than I would have, but Pacifica Radio was doing their own coverage and told me they might have me on to comment. So Wednesday night, I did get my 8 minutes to comment on why we need third parties. And we'll put the link to my segment in the chat. But, Monday, even before we got to the convention, it started with that hack judge, Eileen Cannon, ruling that the special counsel, Jack Smith, that is prosecuting the classified documents case against Trump, the special counsel is unconstitutional. I mean, that ruling is ridiculous on its face. And it only took special counsel Jack Smith 48 hours to get an appeal into the appeals court. And the appeals court is probably going to overrule Cannon, but then it'll go to the Supreme Court. But I think even those Republican hacks there probably can't go so far as to rule unconstitutional something that is very constitutional and authorized in law. But Judge Cannon accomplished her mission, and that was delaying the trial till after the election. And if Trump wins, he'll just have the Justice Department drop this case and the other federal cases against him. And he'll put pressure on the state cases in New York and Georgia to drop those too, threatening funding and all the, ways the federal government can twist the arms of states. And you put that together with the absolute immunity from criminal prosecution that the Supreme Court gave the president on July 1st, and not only made Trump get away with all the crimes he's done, he has a get out of jail free card to do more crime, going on another crime spree. I mean, the court system has been totally corrupted, the federal court system in particular, by these Republican appointments. And the U.S. now has the kind of politicized courts characteristic of authoritarian regimes. So that was even before we got to the convention. And then that night, Monday night, the Teamsters president, Sean O'Brien, spoke, and I was sick. I was disgusted. He praised Trump as, quote unquote, one tough SOB, which just reinforced Trump's message that he is the strong man, the vigorous, strong candidate in comparison to the frail and weak Biden. It was an implicit endorsement of Trump. And for union members and workers generally who might want to vote for the Republicans for cultural reasons, Sean O'Brien, and they might have been hesitant for economic reasons, Sean O'Brien gave him permission and even economic reasons to vote for Trump. Now, I'm a retired Teamster, so I'm particularly sickened by this. And O'Brien always was a Jimmy Hoffa guy, which was a very top-down, close to the rank and file kind of administration. He was a Hoffa guy until Hoffa removed him from the package division. He was head of it. And as the lead organizer in our 2017 UPS contract negotiations, because even O'Brien couldn't go along with the concessions that Hoffa was ready to make. And in the end, Hoffa shoved that contract down our throats, even though we rejected it by a majority vote, but not the 2/3 majority we needed to prevent Hoffa from signing it anyway. Since then, Teamsters have changed the Constitution, so that won't happen again. But O'Brien is still in the mold of Hoffa, not a reformer promoting rank and file power. Don't be fooled by that. Even though the Teamsters got a pretty good contract at UPS this year, I think if they'd gone out on strike, they'd have got more and they would have felt their own power, the rank and file. Instead, O'Brien's getting credit for it. And I think the speech foretold how O'Brien will deal with the Trump administration if there is one. He's going to bargain and beg with it instead of fighting it into delegitimizing its anti-worker agenda. And he was also disrespectful to Teamsters like me because it was the Republicans in Congress that nearly unanimously opposed the Butch-Lewis Act, which was the $86 billion bailout in 2021 that was attached to the COVID American Recovery Act. And that Butch-Lewis Act saved the pensions of over 2 million workers, including 400,000 Teamsters, including me and probably Sean O'Brien himself. Only 29 Republicans in the House voted for the Butch-Lewis Act, and no Republicans in the Senate did. So it was just nauseating for O'Brien to legitimize this fascistic anti-worker Republican Party by speaking to it as if it was a normal political party. It's no longer a conservative party. It's an extremist right-wing party. And I think Harold Meyerson had a comment in the New Republic about O'Brien's speech that captured my feelings pretty well. He wrote, "Workers of the world, throw up." And, all of O'Brien's populist rhetoric in this speech was for show because it made the Republicans look better than they are. He put window dressing on the Republicans' totally anti-union, anti-worker policy positions. And his rhetoric in the Republican convention doesn't mean anything for the Republicans' anti-union, anti-worker record and promises in their 2024 platform. If O'Brien had gone there and called out Elon Musk, who had just pledged $45 million a month to the Trump campaign, and demanded that Musk start bargaining with the unions already among his plants, like in Sweden, and recognized unions at the other plants and his other companies, that would have been interesting. And if O'Brien had called out the Republicans' anti-immigrant worker barbarities, it would have been really interesting. But of course, O'Brien didn't do anything provocative like that. So O'Brien's going to speak to the Democratic convention, but whatever he says there cannot erase that one tough SOB video clip that was a gift to the Trump campaign. So had to get that off my chest as a Teamster. It's disgusting what O'Brien did. And this is what I said in my comment on Pacifica Radio. Instead of going to the Republicans as an alternative to the Democrats who do take labor's support for granted, O'Brien and labor and other progressive social movements should be building an independent progressive party like the Green Party. That will give us far more leverage than begging the Republicans for attention and respect when they have nothing but disrespect for us. And with independent political action, we start electing people, and the Democrats will either have to enact some of the demands that we're putting forward or lose votes and seats to us. That's where our leverage is, not going to the goddamn Republican Party and, begging for respect. That was, oh man, that got me going for the whole week. So I didn't watch a lot of the speeches. I read about it in the papers. I was listening to Pacifica's coverage, was interviewing, the demonstrators outside and some cops from Columbus that had been brought in for security, shot and killed a black man on the streets of Milwaukee. There was a lot of other stuff going on, and Pacifica was covering that. But on Thursday night, I did suffer through Donald Trump's long, rambling, low energy, 93-minute speech. And low energy, he used to say that about Jeb Bush, but Trump was low energy. The teleprompter had a speech that was about 30 minutes long that was trying to portray Trump as a unifying candidate for all the people, but Trump couldn't help himself. And he went off the cuff for an hour of extra comments. That was his usual divisive dark side. It was one fantastic lie after another, from the big lie about the 2020 election being stolen to the so-called invasion of what he called illegal aliens, as if we're being invaded from space. And that was in keeping with the theme on Thursday. Earlier in the day, they had virulently anti-immigrant speakers, and they had given the crowd placards that said, quote, "Mass deportation now!" exclamation point. End of quote. They're planning to put millions of people in detention camps for deportation. It is nothing like we've ever had. And he, in his speech was trying to portray himself and all of us as victims of democratic repression and mismanagement and mayhem and murder by immigrants, and then portray himself as the savior who he alone can save us, as he said, in his first campaign. That speech was a gift to the Democrats if they'll take advantage of it. And if they can't beat him when he's talking craziness like this, they deserve to lose. On the issues, it is noteworthy that the Republicans didn't even mention abortion from the podium. They know they're on the wrong side of that issue with the voters, and so they're trying to avoid it. And so on abortion, on economic justice, on climate and environmental protection, right down the line, the Democrats are on the winning side of those issues. And as Greens, we know the Democrats' failures on those issues, they come up way short. but at least they're not going in the same direction as the Republicans, who are going to make it all worse. But by contrasting the unpopular reactionary Republican positions on these issues to their own, the Democrats could win. In fact, they should win in a landslide, because Trump is so flawed as a person, and he's attached to these unpopular positions. But, the question is, will the Democrats meet the challenge? And, right now, they are still not decided. After his debate debacle, Biden has only confirmed his problems in the eyes of the public concerning his mental acuity and his physical fitness in the interviews and campaign events he has done. He's showing the same symptoms of forgetfulness and frailty and confusion that he showed in that debate. And there's a chorus of Democratic donors and members of Congress calling for him to step aside. That is swelling. We've had the first breaks in the Congressional Progressive Caucus, notably Jamie Raskin and Mark Pocan, as well as the first breaks from the Black and Hispanic caucuses. I think it's significant that Sherrod Brown of Ohio called on Biden to step aside yesterday, because he's in a close race with a real wingnut in the Republican side, but with Biden at the top of the ticket, he doesn't think he can win. And reporters are saying that many more in Congress that have gone public, as well as among donors, are saying in private, Biden's got to go. And now Democratic leaders like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, former President Barack Obama are signaling in various ways that Biden needs to step aside. And we also have reports from anonymous sources that Biden's inner circle and even his family are considering how to have him step aside. But the public facade from the Biden camp is still, he's running and he's not getting out. Of course, they will say that until the minute they decide he's stepping aside. But, I can't predict what Biden's going to do. This is like watching, a Greek or Shakespearean tragedy unfold. I do know if Biden steps aside, I think he'll be seen as a virtuous, unselfish statement who put the country first in the face of the menace of Trump and the MAGA Republicans. And if he stays in and loses, he will be seen as a vain, egotistical politician who gave us the return of Trump. Now, I think if he stays in, he still could win, because on the issues, the people are more with the Democrats than the Republicans. But can he articulate that in a campaign at all? That's the question. He was never a very good communicator, but now he's downright incoherent a lot of times. Now, if he steps aside, Kamala Harris has the inside track. And I think if the Democrats tried to bypass her, they would alienate women and people of color, the core of the Democratic base, if they passed her up. And if they nominate her, I think she would unify and energize the Democratic base. They'd have a new lease on life. And she's the prosecutor. She would use her prosecutor's skills to destroy the lying Trump in her messaging. And if she got a debate with him, it would be brutal for Trump. Remember what she did to Biden in the Democratic primary debate back in 2019, when Biden was defending his opposition to school busing for desegregation. And she said, that little girl was me. She was bused to integrate schools in Berkeley, California. So that showed a prosecutor's killer instinct, and I think she would kill Trump in a debate. And I think she would kill him in a election. I think she'd do much better in the battleground Midwestern states in the Rust Belt, like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, in the battleground states with large Latino populations like Arizona and Nevada, and the battleground states with large Black populations like Georgia, North Carolina, and now Virginia, which is Biden's behind there now. Of course, for us as Greens, Harris still has the same problematic policy problems that Biden has. But as a candidate who can stop Trump, I think she'd be far more effective than Biden. So we'll see what happens. Meanwhile, since we last were here at this podcast, the election in Rwanda happened, where we had the Democratic Green Party candidate Frank Habeniza running. He was on our podcast about a month ago. And we have the results. No surprise, Paul Kagame won. They say he got 99.2% of the vote, and Frank Habeniza only got 0.5%, and another independent candidate got 1/3 of 1%, but nobody believes those numbers. Habeniza's vote was about 45,000 for president, but the Green candidates for parliament got 10 times more votes, according to what was reported. Over 407,000 votes. That was 4.6% of the vote. And they got 2 seats in the parliament like they had before. But those numbers also seem rigged. Habeniza had said before the election that the Green goal was to elect 20 MPs. And that would have been a quarter of the parliament. But that was ambitious. It would have meant 40% of the parliamentary vote. 53 of the seats were elected by proportional representation. So that's why they need 40% of the vote to get 20 seats. But maybe 40% is closer to what the real Green support is in Rwanda. Kagame, the dictator, may be popular, but he's not 99.2% popular. And the other thing to note here is that the U.S. is the biggest bilateral donor to Kagame's regime, about $170 million a year, including military aid. And Rwanda's military and its M23 proxy militia are operating in the Eastern Congo to protect multinational corporations that exploit the mineral resources there. The wars there since 1990s have killed 6 million people. It's a classic neo-colonial operation by the U.S. and another imperialist policy that we must oppose. And there's a whole long list of them, and not many people are thinking about Rwanda, but I think we should. And then speaking of imperialism, Biden signed another bill, this time for nuclear imperialism. It's called the ADVANCE Act. It stands for Accelerating Deployment of Versatile Advanced Nuclear for Clean Energy, which is a Orwellian description of nuclear power. It passed the House 365-36 on February 28th, and the Senate finally took it up on June 26th. It passed 88-2, and then Biden signed it on July 10th. And what this bill does is subsidize small modular nuclear reactors, which we've had since the 40s. I won't go into the whole critique of them, but it's a failed technology, and it's less economically efficient than larger nukes, which it's a failed industry anyway. It guts the regulations and makes the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, even more of a promoter than a regulator of nuclear power. Now, we've always called NRC, we've said NRC stands for Nobody Really Cares. And now its promotion of nuclear power is codified by this new law, whereas before it was supposed to be a regulator. The bill requires more intensely enriched radioactive fuel called HALEU, H-A-L-E-U, high assay, low enriched uranium, which is just below weapons grade. It's required by these small modular nuclear reactors. And currently the only source of that fuel is Russia. So there's a nuclear proliferations problem. And then it encourages the export of nuclear technology and materials internationally. This is the nuclear imperialism. When we talked with Frank Habeniza from Rwanda, he talked about Kagame's crazy idea to build a nuclear power plant in Rwanda. And at first Westinghouse was doing it, now they're going to the Russians. Next door in Kenya, and we'll put a link in the chat to an article about this. They're proposing to build a nuclear power plant, and there's a Kenyan Anti-Nuclear Alliance, or KANA, K-A-N-A. KANA means reject in Swahili. And there's a real protest. This is on the coastal area just north of Mombasa. It's a beautiful area, and the people there don't want this nuke. But the powers that be with U.S. Backing are pushing for this nuke. And it's the last thing Kenya needs. Kenya is terribly in debt. They'll go into deeper debt to get this nuke built. If it is built, the hot water expelled from the cooling towers is going to further stress the reefs, which are already in trouble from global warming. And solar and wind and storage can, add the power that Kenya needs far more cheaply. So, and then, let's look at who voted against this. Only Bernie Sanders and Ed Markey in the Senate voted no on this bill. And only 36, mostly progressives in the House, voted against it, although Jamal Bowman did not. That's barely 1/3 of the members of the Progressive Caucus, and less, a little more than 10% of the Democrats in the House. And those 36 that voted against it are mostly the same House members as the 37 progressives who voted no on military aid to Israel in March. And that's where we are. Less than 10% of the people in the House and a couple members of the Senate are voting as Green representatives would on most questions. So we're in a really bad situation. So just to wrap up this long rant, I'm going to reemphasize what I said last week. I think as Greens, our strategy to impact federal policies needs to focus on the House of Representatives, the houses where we have our best chance of influencing the debate and moving federal policy. The presidential race and the Senate races in most states are just too expensive and too big for us to have a grassroots impact, but we can influence House elections. And I urge every Green local to start thinking about a plan to get to the point where we can run serious House candidates in each congressional district where we're organized. We need to build the foundation from below. We need to be electing Greens to municipal and then state legislative offices in our congressional districts, and that will build the bench of candidates and experienced campaigners we can draw on to run, really serious competitive congressional races. And even before we get to that point, right now we can set the agenda on those races today by making demands on the Democratic and Republican candidates to take the right positions on our issues: electoral reform, Palestine, Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, tax to rich. These issues are popular with voters, but not the donors of the major party candidates. But we can create a problem for these candidates. We can build popular support for these demands. And even without our own candidates, we can inject these demands into the races. But of course, we got to build to the point where we're running our own competitive candidates, and then we'll really have an impact. And as I mentioned, this is what Ralph Nader has been urging us to do. And the more I think about it, the more I think he's right. At the House level, that's within our capacity to organize and have a real influence. And, we've elected hundreds to local office. We should be electing thousands. And then from there, go to the state ledge and the House. And when we get a caucus in the House, then our presidential campaign will be taken seriously, be unavoidable for the media and the public. So I hope people think about that, because I think that's where we need to go. And went on for about half an hour this time, but like I said, sometimes nothing happens for years, and at other times years happen in weeks, and we're in some of those weeks. So I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. John Cothan: how can we best avoid the fear-mongering of the Republicans and Democrats and keep public conversation focused on real issues like Gaza, violence toward migrants, environmental degradation, disenfranchisement of workers, etc.? It's really hard in the presidential race. But like I was saying, I think in the House races, that's where we can get a platform to begin changing the debate and putting forward our positive reforms and demanding that the candidates say where they stand on them, and use that as a foundation now to get ready to run, competitive House candidates in the future. So I think we can have an impact there right now. At the presidential level, I've been urging Jill Stein to, like, when she gets that spoiler question, say, no, it's Joe Biden who's perpetuating the spoiler problem, because he won't accept a national popular ranked choice vote for president, which would do away with the spoiler problem. So a reporter asking me that question, go ask Joe Biden and see where he stands on that issue. I think we just got to flip the script on them. And all of us can do that when it comes up in our own conversations. Jack Lucas, Howie, do you agree with me that the Green Party should publicly endorse left-wing Democrats in tough primaries like Cori Bush if they co-sponsor helpful legislation like the Fair Representation Act? Well, if I was in her district, yeah, maybe I'd say if you will co-sponsor the Fair Representation Act, then we won't run a candidate against you. Of course, we're late in the period now. I don't think the Greens are running in that district. And if the Greens don't have a candidate, I don't have a problem with individuals. I've done it, saying I urge people to vote for this candidate who's better than the Republican and agrees with us on some issues. I don't think institutionally, as the Green Party, we should be doing that, because I think it's important that we maintain our independent identity in alternative program as an alternative to the Democrats. I think, and this is what I talked about a little bit on that Pacifica radio comment, between the 1830s and the 1930s, the independent left set the public agenda. First it was the anti-slavery question of the abolitionists with the Working Men's Party, the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and finally the Republican Party. And then in the 1870s to 1890s, it was the farmer labor populist parties that put the questions of fiscal and monetary policy, anti-monopoly legislation, women's suffrage. They tried to keep civil rights alive after the restoration of segregation in the South. Direct election of senators. We had a lot of reforms around those questions. And then in the 1900s to the 1930s, the socialists and local labor parties, the Progressive Party in Wisconsin, the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, they elected hundreds of people, including dozens to the House. In 1934, there was talk of an independent left party against FDR, whose first New Deal wasn't that radical or progressive. At that time, between the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota and the Progressive Party in Wisconsin, they had two governors, majorities in two state legislatures, 13 members in the House of Representatives, and 4 senators. I mean, they took those states over. And the issues they put forward in that period, 1900s and 1930s, union rights, worker and consumer protections, minimum wage, 40-hour work week. We won a lot of reforms around those. That the two major parties, what the left did in that 100-year period was put issues into debate that the two major parties didn't want to talk about. Unfortunately, since the 1930s, the communists proposed a popular front with Roosevelt. And most of the left and the labor movement went into the Democratic Party. And then we've never come out, except a few of us. And so now what passes for a left is lost in the sauce. They support Democrats. And even though the left may want Medicare for all, they'll support a candidate like Biden who says he's opposed to Medicare for all. So the left disappears. So that's why I think it's important for us as, Green Party affiliates, not to give formal endorsements to Democrats. But in a race like Cori Bush, where it's a Republican versus a Democrat, I have no problem with Greens saying, yeah, we'll vote for Cori Bush, but also making demands. Okay, I'll endorse you, but if you get on the Fair Representation Act as a co-sponsor. So I think that's how we use our leverage. But we got to keep our independent identity and our sense as an opposition to the Democrats are mainly a neoliberal corporate party. And while there are, progressives, maybe she's a social democrat like Cori Bush, they are a small, less than 10%, as I pointed out, of Congress. They're the left fringe of the Democratic Party, and their voices get confused with the corporate centrists like Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and the other leaders of the Democratic Party. So that's my thoughts on that. Frankie Lee, Howie, what concerns you about the Trump-Vance ticket? Well, Frankie, how much time have you got? There's the abortion question. And Vance makes no exceptions for women that need an abortion. No exceptions. Incest, rape, health, he makes no exceptions. Trump is trying to distance himself from that, but the real Republican Party, the operatives, the people that will come in that are waiting in wings, Trump Project 2025 has identified who they are. They're ready to implement that. So that concerns me about the Trump Vance ticket. They're going to sell Ukraine to Russia. They don't care about Ukraine. They just want the war to end at any cost, no matter what it does to the Ukrainians. Same thing with the Palestinians. I mean, they're just going to tell Netanyahu, wipe them out. As Trump said, he wants Netanyahu to finish the job, which the right-wing leadership of Netanyahu's government has said is basically either accept second-class status within a greater Israel or leave or you die. So it's a genocidal ticket. Think about the Supreme Court appointments, short of reform, which Jill Stein just put out a good proposal on that. The Democrats, actually Biden is starting to voice that pretty late. I mean, he should have done this a long time ago. But if you get a Trump-Vance administration, they'll probably get 2 more appointments. Thomas and Alito are getting up there in years, so they'll step aside and they'll appoint far right replacements for them. If there's a vacancy, Sotomayor is getting up there. They will create a Supreme Court with younger right wingers that will be on the court until at least 2050. So the Supreme Court concerns me. The immigration deportations they're talking about, that really concerns me. That is going to militarize the society and militarize the policing. They're going after, there are about 11 million by most accounts, undocumented people in the United States, but they belong to families. And Trump keeps talking about what they did under Eisenhower, and I'll say it here, they don't say it on TV because it's offensive, it's racist, but they called it back then Operation Wetback. Mexicans got wet, swimming across the Rio Grande. And so they deported over 1 million people in the mid-50s. And many of them were native-born Americans of Mexican ancestry. Some of those people had lived here since before 1848, when the U.S. Took and annexed in a war the Southwest of the United States. So if they go after those 11 million undocumented people, they're going to be going after all kinds of people who look like they are immigrants from Latin America or Jamaica, and they're going to get caught up. And then the family members of these mixed families of, American citizens and undocumented immigrants, they're either going to, separate those families or, deport them all. And then there are countries that won't take those people. So what are they going to do then? Put them in mass detention camps? It's a nightmare. So I don't want to go on and on because I could, but there's much to be concerned about a Trump-Vance administration. And I think the thing we got to be thinking about is, how are we going to resist if it does come to power? I think we got to be public. We got to be on the streets. We got to be in every public forum. It can't be after, like it was right after 9/11, when the global justice or ultra globalization movement folded up its tents. People were afraid after the Patriot Act and demoralized by the jingoism, calling for regime change wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And it took, from 2001 until the fall of 2002 for the beginnings of an anti-war movement to come, back out onto the streets and into public. And then it got going. I mean, we had what the New York Times called the world's second superpower as we led up to the invasion of Iraq in March 2003. But by then, it was too late. It was like we had now in terms, we had then about 25 Democrats at the beginning who would oppose the war. And we built that up to about 125 by the last vote before we went to war. But a lot of those people were really not with us. They were succumbing to the pressure of the anti-war movement. But what I'm saying is it took a year to get going. And that gave Bush and the cooperation of the mass media to mobilize people for a war on Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. It was madness. And so we can't let Trump madness, Trumpomania. You heard Hulk Hogan, ridiculous speech. It's like a build up to one of those fake wrestling contests. It's as fake as the whole, Trump narrative. We can't let that kind of craziness get momentum. We got to be resisting from the start. But so those are some of my concerns about the Trump Vance ticket. Violet Content Boutique. Howie, did you hear about Biden's new ideas about Supreme Court regulations and term limits? Any thoughts? Yeah, I've heard he's about to come out with something. It's not confirmed what he will say. So I can't comment on his particular proposals, but I've heard, and Jill Stein is supporting this, 18-year term limits. I think without increasing the court, that means every 2 years. So you would set it up so that one of the justices rotates off every 2 years. And so that would give each president normally 2 appointments. Jill is saying we should double the court to 18 and give presidents a new appointment every year with 18-year term limits. Either of those would be a big improvement over what we got. Plus, Jill's calling for Congress to impose a mandatory code of ethics on the Supreme Court, and I support that too. So the thing is, why the hell did it take Biden 4 years? Given all the terrible decisions the Supreme Court has done, to do that. He's too much of a inside the beltway traditionalist. He wouldn't take on a filibuster, which meant a dozen good reforms the House passed. The Democrats passed in the House couldn't get through the Senate, even when they had a majority in the Senate because of the filibuster, which required 60 votes to bring a bill to the floor. And Biden wouldn't touch that, which meant none of these reforms could go through. I mean, you think the Republicans would have hesitated if you flip places? Hell no. In fact, they lowered the threshold. They took away from the filibuster the confirmation of Supreme Court justices because they knew they couldn't get it passed. They could get it passed by a low majority, but not a 60 vote majority. So McConnell got that changed through. When the Democrats had the power, they should have used it. And that's a problem. I mean, the Democrats don't know how to fight the right. They act as if, they're, operators in good faith that you can bargain with them. And no, they just will do anything to advance their power and their program. And so Biden's trying to do bipartisanship with the party that tried to overthrow his election. I mean, he's not only being punked by Netanyahu, he's being punked by the Republicans right in front of him in Congress. And this is a guy that's been in Congress for decades. It's just hard to believe that this is happening before our eyes, but it is. So, Biden will come out with something soon. It'll probably be better than what we got, but where the hell has he been? And actually, where the hell is he now? Because it doesn't look like he's all there anymore. D.D. Dimmitt, RFK Jr. is saying this step will allow both his campaign and the Libertarians to accept $1 million donations from single donors. How does that work? Well, you have these joint organizing committees, and normally it works within a party. So that's how I think the donation limit there is in the 40,000s rather than now it's, I think, it was 3,600 over maybe it was 5,000 something over both primary and general election. So that's a much bigger contribution. And then it's a PAC, so they can accept multi-million-dollar donations without having to report who gave them. Now, what's unusual about this is it's joint between candidates in different parties. Kennedy, who's an independent, and he has a We the People party in some states, and the Libertarian Party. And it's disgusting. I mean, it's just, working through the loopholes and, promoting right-wing politics. RFK has gone to the far right on many policies, from immigration to Israel, not to mention his anti-scientific COVID stuff. He's even said, climate change is a hoax. The guy's pandering to the Trumpian right. So you link to it looks like Kennedy's website. There are a number of stories in the media you can read about this. It's just disgusting. I mean, it says our elections are up for sale, and the libertarians, and within the libertarians, I mean, one thing we should know: libertarians are at war with each other. Their candidate, Chase Oliver, is not getting a whole lot of support from many of the state parties. The Colorado affiliate took the line away from Oliver and gave it to Kennedy. The chair of the party, who's from the right-wing Von Mises caucus, is really supporting Trump and supporting Kennedy to help Trump. They're a mess, and they're at war. And some states have split. They got new libertarian-type parties. They did that in Pennsylvania. Actually, 2 years ago, I was down there petitioning and ran into some of their petitioners who had split with the libertarians with this right-wing Von Mises party, which is very sexist, homophobic, and racist in a lot of their statements. So that's why you look at the polls, we've come in fourth behind the libertarians, since 2012 at least. This year, it looks like the libertarians are going to come in behind the Greens, according to the polls. They're barely registering 1%, Chase Oliver. Jill is getting 1 or 2%, Cornel West getting 1 or 2%, but he won't get that because he's not going to be on many ballots. But this deal, and I can't remember all the details, but it's a similar scheme by which both Biden and Trump raised billions of dollars in 2020 and are doing it again this time. You get around a lot of the FEC limits on donations by having these joint fundraising committees, which share the proceeds among these different committees that have combined. What's unusual about this is it's cross-party. I don't think anybody's done that before. But it just shows how damn cynical and unprincipled so much of our politics is. Violet at Content Boutique. What strategies do you recommend to gather steam for ranked choice voting and the national popular vote? Should we run petitions? We should start in our municipalities, counties, and states. And it varies from place to place. There are campaigns now in a lot of states. Unfortunately, a lot of the ranked choice voting people have compromised with top 4 primaries because there's a lot of money, particularly in big tech, that's behind having top 4 primaries that are, they call them open primaries. We already have open primaries in many states. That means people not registering in a party can vote in that party's primary. In New York, it's an option parties have. They don't use it very often. Closed primaries means only the registered voters of that party can vote in the primary. What these top 4 proposals are is they're not open primaries are still party primaries. The top 4 primaries are non-party primaries. It's candidates in every party are in the same primary. And what that means is, like in the Green Party, we've had this with top 2 in California. The party may nominate and endorse a candidate, but then anybody who wants to can put Green by their name and pay the fee or submit the signatures and be on the ballot. So when the Green voters go to the ballot and they see a bunch of Greens, they don't know who to vote for. They don't know who the party is supporting. It's a real problem. It takes away our right to nominate our own candidates. And so that's being linked to ranked choice voting. There are 6 state referendums. In Alaska, it's a referendum to repeal. In the other 5 states, it's a referendum to initiate. And that includes Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, Washington, D.C., and Colorado. And unfortunately, the ranked choice voting is linked to the top 4. And some people say we should vote them down because top 4 is terrible. Others say we should vote for it so we get ranked choice voting. Then we can go back and restore party primaries. You'd have to discuss that in your own state and figure out how you want to do it. So anyway, there's a lot of momentum. So Green should be in the middle of these movements. And you can go to groups like Fair Vote or Ranked Choice US or Rank the Vote US and, contact them on their website, see what's going on in your state, check around what's going on in your municipality. And we should be leading these campaigns. I mean, it was the Greens that got the new wave of ranked choice voting going in the early 2000s in San Francisco and in Oakland. Those were Greens that led those campaigns. And we went from 2 jurisdictions in 2000 to 24 jurisdictions in 2020 to over 50 jurisdictions today. And then we got these 6 statewide ballot initiatives in the upcoming election. So this is a reform that's gaining momentum. It's a reform we're winning. And so when you say, should we run petitions, we could petition for a ballot initiative statewide. In some communities, you can go to your city council and say, we want ranked choice voting, particularly proportional ranked choice voting for the city council. And if you don't get a response, there may be an initiative procedure. In New York, we've got one. We got to get 10% of the voters in the first round. And then if the city council still refuses, we got to get 5% of the voters in a second petition. And then it goes on to the ballot. So, but you got to research your own local situation. But I think this is an issue that it's popular with voters, particularly once they understand it. And it's something natural for the Greens. You're not going to see the incumbent, whether it's Democrat or Republican in your community, lead it. And so it's up to the Greens. And I think this is an issue by which we can become known and popular in our communities. So, the strategy I recommend is, find out what's going on in your state and in your community, and then get together with others on a strategy how to implement it. And, the legalities of that vary from state to state. Like in New York, we can't do an initiative petition. We would have to get the state legislature to introduce legislation. So each state, each community has its own circumstances, but, we can find out what those are and start organizing. And the other strategy I'd recommend is, decide what you want first. For example, if we were to do it in Syracuse, like we've talked about, we would propose proportional ranked choice voting. We wouldn't, bring a coalition together and say, what do you want to do? We want proportional ranked choice voting so we have a proportional representation on the city council. And we'll build a coalition around that demand rather than, starting open-ended. And you're going to get people who, for example, will argue, well, we can get ranked choice voting from single-member districts easier. Of course, you get that reform, then how are you going to move to proportional ranked choice voting without many years in between? Because, the council is going to say, we already dealt with that. Why are you bringing it back up? Why didn't you ask for that in the first place? So I would say, get your program together, figure out a strategy to build support for it, and then build a coalition around that. Well, our hour is up, and I don't know if I got to a lot of your questions. I wish we had more time, but we don't want to make this a long commitment for people. We want to be able to make it something you can do every week. So we're going to have to stop it there. I've got guests who are Green candidates coming on for the next 2 weeks. Next week, it'll be Layla Hazou, who is the Green candidate for U.S. Senator in Pennsylvania. She's a Palestinian American making the issue of the genocidal war in Gaza her central issue. So I'll be talking to her, and I will be in Pennsylvania. I will be petitioning with her earlier in the day in Harrisburg at the Capitol. And then we'll go to actually that same bookstore that I did a podcast last year when I went down and petitioned, or 2 years ago, when I went down and petitioned for the statewide ticket of the Pennsylvania Green Party. And I had Jubilant X. Williams on the podcast that time. So we're going to do it again from that bookstore. And so you can find out what Layla's campaign is about and what's going on in Pennsylvania. And the week after that, I expect to have a congressional candidate from New Jersey. So we'll find out what Greens are doing in their campaigns the next couple of weeks. So I hope everybody has a good. I will not be in Lancaster. I'm going to Harrisburg. So last day of petitioning. They just asked me, late in the process. So won't be in Lancaster. I might drive through it. I have to look at the map, but I'm on my way to Harrisburg. So there'll be an event that evening they're planning with Layla and myself and other Greens as a fundraiser and rally. Once we're petitioning at a Pride event on the Capitol Plaza, which was good when I petitioned there 2 years ago with Jubilant X. Williams. So hopefully I'll get a good number of signatures for the Pennsylvania Greens. So anyway, have a good week this week. I'm sure we'll have a lot more news. What's going to happen with this Democratic ticket, I think, is something a lot of us will be watching. And meanwhile, trying to advance our own candidates. So I'll see y'all next week at the same time, 3 o'clock Eastern time.